session I've wanted to do for some time, and I guess I just had the opportunity to present as part of Global Azure. So I'm really interested to hear your feedback, get your thoughts and comments as they come. Perhaps you might be watching this as well after today during the live stream. So send through any comments you have. I'll be sure to try and get back to you when I can. So my name is Jesse Ludon. I'm currently a principal consultant in Azure and DevOps. I work from Australia in Sydney. So these are my social details as well. You can see here I've got a blog. I'm on GitHub, of course, LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me and share your thoughts and knowledge as well when you can. So let's look at the agenda. The agenda for today's session, just so you know as well, I'm not very a big fan of PowerPoint slides, so I'm trying to keep this as minimal as possible. So today's agenda, policy as code, of course, will cover pretty much all of these different tools and concepts. Bicep is the new domain-specific language for Microsoft, and it covers a lot of the Azure resource deployments that you can do and managing as code. GitHub Actions is an amazing tool. So for CI/CD, I use GitHub Actions as part of this demo. You'll see how I use that. You'll see the YAML construct, and we'll look at how we use GitHub Actions to deploy to multiple environments at scale. It's a really important tool, I think, in your arsenal to use when you're managing enterprise scale environments and when you're working with Azure policy as code. So we'll combine all those three concepts and tools into a number of demos over this session. We'll start to finish off with some Q&A if you have any questions as part of this. And of course, at the very end, there is swag provided by Microsoft as part of Global Azure. So hang on for that if you can. This is one of my few slides I have as well in this session. I promise there won't be too many more. So where do we start? Initially, when I was getting used to what Azure policy is and trying to find out information, I really leveraged the Microsoft documentation. That's the first link you see here. I highly recommend you take a look at it if you're just starting out with Azure policy. And even, I've been working with Azure policy for a year now. I still reference the Microsoft documentation. It is an amazing, trusted resource. I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface of what's in there. I feel like Microsoft have really driven the policy community through a very detailed explanation of JSON and all the different usage patterns you can do with Azure policy. It's a very in-depth sort of field. So definitely leverage the Microsoft documentation initially. You may not understand everything that's in there, but it's great to just know that you can go there if you have any sort of particular questions about how something works with Azure policy, or you might be missing some key information that you need as part of your policy development. Second item on that list, of course, Visual Studio Code. I'll showcase this as part of my demos, but I practically live in Visual Studio Code. It's one of the first tools I open every single day. I can't even imagine what I used to use before Visual Studio Code was alive and where it is today. It's an amazing tool. I also use it for blogging, not just for policy development. It's great to write blogs in Markdown through Visual Studio Code, push that to my blog and have it published through GitHub Pages. That's one of the flows that maybe I'll showcase to you another day. Third item on that list, Azure CLI. So recently Bicep was integrated with Azure CLI, so you don't need to download and use Bicep separately as part of your development. So if you have the latest version as Azure CLI, it comes with Bicep. Brilliant. I'll showcase this as well. GitHub. Wow. If you're not on GitHub, I think you're missing out. I use GitHub for Azure policy development for source control, and as part of my Git flow. So from Visual Studio Code, I'm basically doing Git commits and Git pulls and pushes into my repo in GitHub, hooked up to GitHub Actions to do CI/CD into my Azure environment. And I think that flow is very consumable. It's highly available. It's scalable as well between different teams and users. And I just highly recommend it, of course, if you're not already looking into it. Last but not least, the Azure Policy Visual Studio Code extension. Wow, this was not around. This tool was not around when I first started working with Azure Policy and when I was creating custom policies for customers. It's a really, really great tool for seeing policy-specific aliases. So aliases that you need to create a custom policy and to use Azure Policy. You can see these inline next to actual resources in your environment through this tool. That is only one of the use cases for this tool. And I think if you check it out, you'll actually find a lot more use cases for it. Certainly, it's helped me a lot in my development days for Azure Policy. So certainly check it out. I'll include links to all these in the description of this video later on. So let me show you this. Normally, I would kind of summarize with these key takeaways at the conclusion of the session, but I think I'll just talk about some of these key takeaways from this session early on, just so to give you a kind of expectation of what we're going to cover and some of the concepts here and what I'm trying to, I guess, share with you today in terms of my experience and what I think will help you in your policy development journey, if that's how I would explain it. So firstly, tooling. The tools I just mentioned in the previous slide have really helped me a lot. I think tooling, it's not the most critical thing. Like if you don't have Visual Studio Code, if you don't have Azure CLI, you can still work with Azure Policy. You can still do policy development. The tooling I mentioned before has helped me to do it rapidly and more efficiently, and just leverage the investment that Microsoft and the community have made in those tools. So I think it does make a difference, but it is definitely not a necessary critical dependency for you to get started with Azure Policy development, if that makes sense. Don't repeat yourself. A lot of things with policy development, JSON, doing things as code is helped along by following this methodology of not repeating yourself. So I'll show you a bit what that means as we go through the demos and we look at some of the code. And also that it ties into that third point here, reusable code and using modules. So this is how you make your code scalable across many different use cases. So if you write something very custom, for example, that is very specific to a certain use case, it's very hard to take that custom bit of policy or code and apply it to a different environment. So I'll try and show you what that means in this session. Simplicity over complexity. I think this helps a lot. Trying to keep things really simplistic in its design and implementation. Complex things can slow down development. It can also slow down troubleshooting, and that's what I found just in my experience. When I'm troubleshooting a policy that's very complex over a policy that's very simple, that can really increase the amount of time it takes to get to the root cause of why a policy is not working, or why why the user is being denied against a certain policy, for example. Now, consistent naming. This is something I think is often overlooked, but for example, parameters, variables, certain things you might use over and over again within your policy environment. The naming for these objects and items in your development, if it's consistently named, it makes it much easier to find later on and modify as well. I can't tell you the number of times I've had to refactor different code that I've worked on in the environment. So I've refactored names, I've refactored properties. If the naming was consistent, it made it a lot easier to do that refactoring. CI/CD workflows. Wow, this is something I really appreciate. Being able to do CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development with Azure Policy. I can't tell you how great it is to have a scheduled CD job after hours, just running and making sure that the policy that I've created in GitHub still works against my environment, regardless of changes that have happened. And a good use case of a continuous development job is in your policy development, you may be referencing certain names. So you may reference certain names or IDs or something built in within the Azure environment. Now, those names and IDs may change. They may change when Microsoft push an update to the portal or to the policy. And you won't really pick that up unless you have continuous development built into your workflow. So I think it's important. I'll show you a bit of this as well, the way I've done it with YAML and GitHub Actions later on. Test. Testing policy it's a place in your development that I think is often overlooked. Certainly, I historically have not had much time with testing. So you may do a lot of work to create the policy, deploy it, and then maybe 10% of your actual time frame or budget is actually allocated to testing, and I think that's a problem at scale, especially. So there's community development, there's community code out there. I think PowerShell is heavily used for testing as well. Check it out. I'll try and include links as well to help you with that. Just something to think about as well. The earlier you can test in your development workflow, the earlier you catch possible problems that will occur in production during the usage of your policies, if that makes sense. Last but not least, leveraging the community. Wow, the community of Azure and policy in particular, I think has really helped me over the years. It's been so great to see so many different MVPs and just experts in their field getting on board with Azure Policy, really contributing their expertise and their knowledge and experience in public as well. So they'll create examples, they'll create repos, they'll write blogs about it. This is something I think really helps new people easily adopt policy, and it really helps drive community engagement as well. So I think if you need any tips on that, certainly let me know. I have a list of people I can certainly refer you to as well in terms of who's helped me get on board with Azure Policy. All right, so that's really the key takeaways. Now I just want to show you. So we have our Azure environment. I'm showcasing one Azure environment that I have here today. I'll just show you. I actually have no assignments in this environment, and so in this subscription, it's a clean slate. So there's no assignments. There's nothing that's been deployed. Let me refresh that as well. Yeah, so there's nothing that's been deployed. If I look at the custom type policies, there's nothing there. All we can see here are the existing built-in policies. I can sort by, if you don't know, I can sort by policy and the definition type and initiative. So this is going to be my demo environment where I'm showcasing how the code works from my repo. And the repo I'm working from is this one here. So global bow, Azure Policy as code. And we have a Bicep folder here containing three, let me just zoom in. So we have a Bicep folder here containing 3 folders. So level 1, level 2, level 3. The way it's organized is very much, so if you were starting out with Azure Policy, you didn't know much about it, you wanted to use Bicep for your policy development, go to this level 1 folder here and start there. If you're a bit more experienced with Azure policy, maybe you're coming from a developer background and a bit of infrastructure as well, certainly I recommend you getting started with level 2. If you're already using Azure policy as code workflows today, you're familiar with GitHub Actions, CI/CD, maybe with Azure DevOps, and you just want to kind of look to leverage Bicep as your new language for policy development, I think you can jump straight to level 3, and you'll be able to pick it up really quickly from that folder there. So there's the description here in the README. This is really a breakdown of what each folder contains in terms of attributes for your policy development. So level 1, we're going to look at first, includes only built-in policies. You can have built-in policies, you can have custom policies. Level 1 really starts you off with just the basics, just to get you familiar with the concept of policy as code. And of course, it uses an initiative and an assignment. So you can assign policies directly to your subscription and resource groups. I highly, highly recommend you use initiatives. It's a way of grouping policies together. You can have multiple initiative assignments, you can have multiple policies and initiatives, and it's a much more scalable way to do policy management, and you'll see why as well. Level 1, one main Bicep file. What I mean by that is there's just a single file that we manage all the policy as code within. Okay, so this is really a starting point. It's an entry point for you to get on board with Azure policy as code. And we're going to do manual CLI deployment as level 1. So it's very easy to do. This really just gets us started. It's really like a proof of concept. This is a proof of concept. So let me open this up in Visual Studio Code. I've already cloned that repo locally to Visual Studio Code. And my directory is level 1. So importantly, you should change your directory to whichever folder that you're working from. It just makes it easier to run the different cmdlets that I've put in the README. So the README here contains the default parameters that are used as part of this policy development. It contains CLI snippets. So you've got AZ Bicep builds, you've got AZ login, AZ deployment. There's a policy state trigger scan here you can run, but let's look at the actual code. So main.bicep, there's just a single file here. Important to note, if I just zoom in, the word main is not it's not a requirement. So you can name this Bicep file whatever you like, and you'll see later on in the demos I do. This is really just, it makes it easier to identify, and it's really just the standard name that you can assign to a Bicep file, right? So this could be anything you want. This could be named policy.bicep, dev.bicep. It's up to you, really. Okay. So the way I organize my policy Bicep files, if you want to call them that, is we have a target scope at the very top, and currently it's set to subscription. You can set this to resource group. You can set this to management group as well. I usually set it to subscription because I like to apply policies at that level. Just know you can change this. Now parameters I like to have at the top. So you can see comments here. Comments are done with a // Parameters I like to group here. So we've got parameter for policy source, and it's a string. And I'm inputting here a string for the repo that I'm deploying this policy from. So this is really the source control, that I identify with this policy deployment. And you can put it whatever you like in here. I like to put the repo in terms of, when I go to actually deploy this, and when I look at this policy from Azure, I can see where it's come from. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. there's a number of arrays here that I've used to input values for these policies, for this policy that I have in this file. Let me collapse everything. So I'll condense this just to make it more readable initially, and then we'll dive into what each of these resources do. So really, there's three key resources that you'll work with as part of Azure policy. The initial resource that you'll work with is a policy itself, so a policy definition. Second resource will be an initiative, and a third resource will be an assignment. So you can see in this policy main.bicep file, I don't have a resource for a policy definition. The reason for that is because I'm only using the built-in policy, so I don't need to define a resource here for a built-in policy because it already exists in Azure, right? So what we normally do, if we're only using built-in policies, we define an initiative, and this is really an initiative is it's a grouping of I'd say it's a grouping of common policies that you can have in your environment. So you can see an initiative in Microsoft's definition in this ARM sort of definition here is called a policy set. Important to know that. So you may not know, initiative means policy set. Often I refer to it as an initiative because I don't like saying policy set, but when you start looking through Microsoft documentation, you'll see references to initiative and policy set here. And you can see where I'm using the latest API at the time of recording here as well. Cool, let me expand this. So there's some required properties that will need to be placed in your initiative and assignment resource as part of policy as code. One of them is policy type. Display name, I don't think that's required, but I like to input it anyways because I like to have it all consistent. So you can see here, initiative one name is mentioned multiple times. This is actually a parameter that I've defined. Sorry, no, it's a variable I've defined up here. So I like to group the variables together here. So that's just statically defined at the top. You can name that whatever you like. If I wanted to pass in that value for the initiative name, I would actually change that to a parameter and place it up here. But for this purposes of this demo, I do like to have just a static name for the initiative and the assignment and the policy definition as well. So you'll see them as variables. And I also have outputs for each of the resources that I'm creating as part of this policy file. And I think this is a pattern, even though you may want to adopt this pattern, because even though you might not be using these outputs, as you scale your development, so as you go, as we showcase through these levels of the session today, as you scale your policy development, you will need to use outputs and inputs to reference certain resources as part of your development. So even though we're not using these outputs, I put them here anyways, just to show you, this is something that you probably should build into your policy early on. So metadata, this metadata key, it contains some useful sub keys here that we can use for policy development, policy as code. One of them is category. So category is what you see in the portal. So if I go to definitions, you see here there's a category. Zoom in a bit here. So there's different categories you can see already in the portal. And when you create a new policy, you can actually assign it to a set category, like an existing category, or you can create a new category. And I like to create a new category. That way I just have all my custom policy as code categories grouped together from the portal side of things. And source here, this is something I put in myself. You can have different subkeys here. You can have source, you can have time deployed, so date today, 17th April. You can do something like that, it's really up to you and whether it adds value. So I think at a minimum, you should probably have metadata, category, and version. The source here is a parameter in this policy definition. It's a parameter that I'm passing in, and I'm using the repo name as I mentioned before. And what you'll see later on is this will appear in the initiative and all the assignments and all the policy definitions that we create as part of our development. And I think it's kind of just a marker. So if someone is working from the portal, or if they're using some sort of CLI to extract custom policies, and they want to be able to see what where this policy came from, where was it created from programmatically. This is a good way, I think, some key metadata that can be attached to your policy as code deployment. So we've got some parameters here as part of this initiative. We've got policy definitions. Note that I've added in comments here for what definition is actually being passed into this initiative, because as you can see here, we need to use the definition ID. And this is, it's not very human readable. So this is the ID. It's a long string. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a great memory to be able to memorize that, this ID here, 988, relates to a policy called allowed locations for resource groups. So I put this comment in here just as a, kind of a reminder within my code that that's what this policy ID relates to. Now, later on in this session, I will actually show you as well a trick you can do with defining your policy definitions within this policy definitions array to make it easier to identify programmatically what these policies actually are, other than just from the ID here. And this is a built-in ID for a built-in policy, okay? Whoops. So we've got, so in this initiative, we have four policies, built-in policies being passed in, and there's parameters being passed in as well. So we've got allowed locations for resource groups, allowed locations, allowed virtual machine size SKUs, audit virtual machines without disaster recovery configured. And this allowed, so these parameters that you see here for these policy definitions being passed in, they are defined initially as part of the initiative definition up here. So they match word for word, character for character, these parameters here, and you can see the type is an array. So the important part as part of this initiative policy as code deployment is to pass in the values for those parameters to the initiative. You should assign a parameter value as part of your codes here. So I've got some example values here being passed into the list of allowed locations array. So initially, as part of level 1, I just want to show you that this is a default value that you can assign as part of this parameter, and you can pass it in as part of your deployment. But later on, as you progress through a policy as code sort of enterprise scale workflow, you actually want to be able to manage your parameter values per environment using parameter files. So you might have default values for these parameters defining your code, and then you can also overwrite them using different parameter files as part of your deployment. And that's how you actually have a scalable way of managing a single set of initiatives, policies, and assignments from a single source control repo, going out to different environments and different Azure subscriptions, for example. So that's pretty much the initiative in a nutshell. So when you define new initiatives, you can pass in policy definitions. Each one of these blocks defines which initiative, which policy you're passing in. And when you, so like I mentioned before, this is a built-in policy ID. When you create your own custom policy as part of your policy as code, you'll need to reference the ID of your custom policy. And I'll show you how to do that as well in the next demo. Lastly, there's the assignment part. So the assignment resource is very similar to an initiative resource. It has similar sort of properties here. We define, so display name, description. This enforcement mode is, it's important to note here that there's two possible values for enforcement. By default, it is using the enforcement value of default. And what default means, sorry, it needs to be capital D. So what default means is when you assign this policy from your policy as code and it's active in Azure, enforcement will be enabled. So any actions, so auditing, deny, deploy, modify, those kind of actions that exist in your built-in policies and custom policies will be enforced. And this is what the default enforcement mode means. There is also another enforcement mode. I think it's, yeah, there we go. Do not enforce. This is, I think this is important for your policy development. So when you're deploying to say prod, initially you may not want to enforce your policies from the assignment. So you may set the do not enforce toggle here from this value. And that way, when you deploy it, it's not going to have an immediate effect, but at least you can see from the policy compliance perspective which resources will actually get triggered as non-compliant. And then if you're happy with the resources that have been found to be non-compliant for your assignment, you can then change this enforcement mode back to default, so it'll actually start taking those policy effects that you're looking for. So those are the two possible values as part of an assignment enforcement mode. I am piping this out and bringing in the value from a parameter. It's called assignment enforcement mode. So the parameter is defined here. Now I am setting a default value here, but of course we can override this using CLI and also parameter files, which I'll showcase later on. Again, with the metadata, I'm using that source metadata key and value there, just to ensure, when we look at this assignment programmatically, we can see where the assignment was made from, which repo it's actually come from. And the version here as well, you can increment this as you make changes to your assignment. And the initiative has the same version kind of pattern there as well. So in the assignment, we're passing in an initiative ID. So notice here I don't have to define any sort of long string as part of this policy definition ID like I had to do with the built-in policy definitions as part of the initiative up here. The reason for that is because the initiative that I'm assigning is actually created by our code up here. So the resource for the initiative is it's basically in the same file, right? So all I have to do within Bicep is reference that resource name, initiative.1, and then I'll do a dot, and I'll reference the ID. So this is like an output. You're referencing an output of your resource that you've created within your policy file. I think this is an important thing to note as part of your policy development. It's a really easy way, I think, a great way for Bicep, a great way that Bicep really makes it easy for us to use policy as code. And these parameters here I'm passing in. So when we create the assignment, the parameter values, which are these string values here, will be passed into the assignment. All right, so that's pretty much a walkthrough, very quick walkthrough. I didn't want to take too much of your time of this very simple Bicep file. It's only doing one initiative containing a number of built-in policies and one assignment. So I think this is a kind of, it's a good starter. Now, if you look at the README file, in that repo, it contains some optional steps to actually deploy this and some required steps. So you will need to log in, you will need to authenticate. Later on in the demo, I will showcase using CI/CD, GitHub Actions in YAML, and using GitHub secrets. So the authentication will happen as part of the workflow using service principles. For this initial deployment, as part of like a starter demo, we're just doing a manual deployment using our own credentials. So we're not using a service principal here, although we could. And it's certainly important as part of your large scale policy deployment, you should be using service principals and not dependent on a single user account's or a person's credentials to authenticate for obvious reasons. So we have our policy file, we have our environment. There's nothing deployed here. So what I'll do is I'll basically copy this string. I've already authenticated in my CLI here within Visual Studio Code. Now, before this, we could build the Bicep file just to, it's kind of like a validation step. You don't have to do this, but you could build the Bicep file using this command. And what this will do is this will give you the JSON output. So you could look at, because Bicep is really just, it's enabling you to rapidly build infrastructure as code without having to worry about the typical ARM template JSON style dependencies. But if you wanted to look into that, if you wanted to look into the JSON under the hood, you would just use this command. So az bicep build, and you reference the file. So I can do this right now. I'll just quickly show you. So there we go. You can see we've got now in that folder, we've got a main.json file here. And if you look at this, it is pretty much what you would expect if you were using an ARM template natively. So the Bicep file builds this JSON file, which then gets deployed into your environment. And I think when you're troubleshooting failed deployments and failed Bicep files, if I can say that, I always use the JSON file as a reference to just kind of look into, what is the actual ARM template being used for this deployment. And I think that's a good strategy to have if you're troubleshooting Bicep files. So we don't actually need that. I can delete that. What we do need is to run this az deployment commandlet, which I'm copying from the README. So notice that it's referencing sub. So if you wanted to deploy this to management group, resource group, you would need to modify your commandlet here. I'm using sub because I wanted to deploy this policy file to my subscription. And that way it will apply to all resources in my subscription at scale. And I don't need to manage individual resource group level onboarding and offboarding as part of my governance for Azure. So we reference the file main.bicep. We add a location because this is a deployment, so we need to specify a location for that deployment, which region I'm deploying into as part of Azure. So let me run this. So in my Azure subscription, there we go. So I can see the assignment initiative has shown up already. It's called initiative 1. Remember, this is the variable, static variable value that we set within our main.bicep file. And of course, you can change this to whatever you like. So, if you have dev test, non-prod, prod, you may want to name your assignments accordingly if you're using, a very large policy as scale deployment there. So I've got our assignment. The assignment contains the policies. The enforcement is enabled because remember we set the parameter default value to default, which means the policy enforcement is enabled, which means any actions that are set within our policies as part of this assignment an initiative will then be taking effect immediately. And you can see some parameters. So these are remember these parameter values that we passed in as part of the default values in the array. So we've got allowed locations. This is the parameter name. It's in the array, and we've got these locations here, which are being allowed for the policy. So East US, West US. We've got allowed virtual machine SKUs, different virtual machine SKUs here being passed in as part of the default parameter value. Remediation, there's no remediation. So sometimes you'll have an initiative which doesn't include policies that have actions for, say, modification or deploying a resource. So if your policy is only doing an audit, for example, it doesn't need a managed identity. It doesn't need to remediate anything. So that's why this is not used. But later on, you will see we'll deploy an initiative and an assignment that has a managed identity as part of it, so we can see how that looks like. Non-compliance messages. This is something really exciting that's only recently come through the governance team in Microsoft. So you can set a default non-compliance message as part of any sort of denied events as a result of your assignment. So that default message applies to any denied events, and you can also set non-compliance messages per policy as well within your initiative. And this is a really great feature, I think, as part of your policy as governance. So governance scale across Azure, you've got many assignments in your environment. There's bound to be some cases where developers and engineers will get denied something, or they won't be able to create or update or delete a resource because it's matching your non-compliance as part of your policy. And if they don't know what to change, or if they don't know where to go in terms of fixing their problem, maybe they're not familiar with Azure policy, this non-compliance method that you can define here can really help them along the way. So I think this is a good feature to know about, and I'll show you later on as well, as part of this policy as code pattern, how to set a default non-compliance message for your assignment, and how to set non-compliance messages per policy definition as well. This is a really exciting feature, I feel, as part of governance at scale. So there you have it. We've deployed the assignment. We'll look at definitions as well. So if I sort by custom definitions, there we go. So custom definitions is a type that you can filter for in the portal. Remember, we set a category. So we can also filter by category here. So custom was also the category that I set within my policy as code, and you can find it here in category now because this definition and this initiative was created by code, thus creating the category that we defined. So this is that's two example ways you can find your policy as code creations really quickly. Use the custom type here, or you can sort by category. Now, if you look at this initiative, so these are all built-in policies that already exist in Microsoft Azure. So I didn't have to create these. We basically pulled them in through our Bicep file, and we reference them by their ID. So you'll notice here, this is a good point that I'll touch on later on as well. You'll notice here there's a reference ID per policy definition in this initiative. This is auto-generated as part of your policy as code development. I'll show you later on how you can actually change this to be whatever you want. And it's important because when you're doing custom deny messages or custom non-compliance messages, you need to reference the reference ID of your policy if you wanted to manage that granularly. And I don't know about you, but my memory sucks. So I cannot use a reference ID. Like, I cannot remember So this reference ID, I don't remember what this actually relates to. I don't remember that this reference ID 8104 relates to policy allowed locations for resource groups. And, I think it's a really great way when you can change this reference ID to whatever you like to make it human readable. I think that's a really great strategy that you can adopt for policy as code. So you can see some deny effects here being used by these built-in policies. You can see the assignment that we set, the parameters that are set within the initiative. It's a custom category that we set from our policy as code. You can see the version. The version is here as well. And the description here as well references the repository name where I deployed this policy from. And that was brought in through our parameter concatenation string. So initiative 1 via global bow / Azure policy as code. So that's pretty much level 1. Once you've done that and you've deployed your policy and your initiative, you kind of get the feel of how this works. Now, if you had resources, for example, in your environment, and you're wondering, okay, so maybe you've deployed this level 1 proof of concept in your environment, and you went to go look at the compliance. You're wondering, why is compliance not updated? As you can see here, you can see the compliance state. Let me zoom in a bit. You can see the compliance state is not started. So typically, the compliance update runs on trigger. I think it's once every 24 hours. I'm not exactly sure, but it's certainly not instant as you deploy new policies and assignments in your environment. So one trick I learned, if I go back to my README file here to get the commandlet, is you can run a policy state trigger scan on your subscription. You can also target resource groups as part of this. You can run a policy state trigger scan to actually kick off an ad hoc compliance scan of your environment. So I'll just do that now as well. I'll have that running in the background. Actually, to have it run in the background, you need to set the no wait command. So I'll cancel that. I'll rerun it again using no wait, the no wait trigger. So there we go. So I don't want to wait for that because it can take some time depending on the actual utilization of the backend policy engine. And there's really no point waiting for it, I think, as part of this demo. So that's really level 1, guys. So level 1, just to go over this again, we've covered using built-in policies as part of our policy as code. We've covered using an initiative and an assignment. We've used one main Bicep file for everything. Very simple. We've used manual CLI deployment, and we've touched on some of the tooling and parameter values and tips and tricks that you can do as part of this. Now, in the README of the repo, I've put in references here for the ARM template resources that we work with as part of policy as code. So these are great references if you wanted to see what's possible as part of policy as code. It goes back to Microsoft's official documentation, and it is constantly updated as they bring in new APIs and everything. So I've referred back to this many times, which is why I think it adds value to have these references in here. Bargraph. Hi, Bargraph. All right, great to see some comments coming through. If you have any questions, I want to keep this session as dynamic and fluid as possible. I'm not talking from a script here, so if you have any questions or comments or feedback about what's being shown, certainly put something in the chat, let me know, and I'll try and get to it as soon as possible, because I don't really feel like this is a formal session where I need to follow a script and tell you things without getting back feedback on the fly. So I want to make this as dynamic and multi conversational as possible. if that makes sense. So yeah, we've covered level 1. Let's look at level 2 here. So we're going to increase our complexity and scale with Bicep usage and policy as code. Level 2 is going to cover custom policies as well. So as part of level 2 deployment, I'm going to create a custom policy, and I'm going to deploy that custom policy into a new initiative and assignment. I'm still going to use one main Bicep file. I think this is important to note because when you scale out your deployment, unless you have, I don't have an exact number for how many initiatives, assignments, and policies you might be managing, but I feel like unless you have more than 20, let's say if you have more than 20 or 10, some sort of double-digit number of resources that you're managing as part of your policy as code, try and keep everything in a single Bicep file. That way you don't have to work with outputs and inputs and passing in values between Bicep files. So for level 2, we're increasing our complexity from level 1, but we're also keeping our Bicep file as small as possible. So it's easy to learn and easy to use as part of your proof of concept, for instance. We're also going to still use manual CLI deployment using those commands I showed you. We're actually going to target multiple Azure environments. So we can do that through CLI, of course. You might have to re-authenticate if your Azure environment is under a different tenant. That's just something to consider. And we're using, for level 2, we're going to use parameter files for environment-specific values. So the way I like to think of this is our policy as code will operate from a single code base. That way it's easy to manage. But the actual deployment of the policy and the initiatives, the assignments to different environments needs to use different parameters and inputs. And the way to do that I think is easy to manage and easy to scale is to use parameter files and then just call those parameter files as part of your CLI deployment, or later on you'll see as part of level 3, you'll see me use some GitHub Actions, YAML CI/CD, which is really great. So let's jump into level 2. In the level 2 folder, we've got the parameter files I mentioned. So there's one for dev test, another one for non-prod, single main Bicep file. So I'll jump into this as code, and I'll change my path to level 2 here. Close down these other files. So in the level 2 main Bicep file, I've actually added in comments here for what's new as part of this Bicep file, right? This is just it's just a flag. So you can, if you're progressing from level 1 to 2 and then later on level 3, you'll see these comments that I put in so that you can actually tell what is new as part of this deployment. So here I've got new parameters. I've got new variables. So I've incremented, you'll see here I've incremented the number for the initiative and assignment names, so they are unique. It's important to note that variable and parameter names need to be unique. So if I tried to add a new variable name here that matched an existing variable name, you'll see I'll get a warning here saying that this variable name is not unique. It's already been used. And if I had an assignment name that was the same, a parameter name, that would bring up an error as well. So parameters and variables, the naming for them needs to be unique in your deployment. And this is per Bicep file. So I recommend thinking about naming early on. Try and use consistent naming as well. It makes it really easy to keep your Bicep and template files reusable. So these are the new variable names because I'm adding a new initiative and a new assignment. So outputs, I've incremented the number of outputs here. Again, we're not using these outputs for anything at this stage because we just have a single Bicep file. But I want to continue on with this pattern of adding in outputs, even though I might not use them, because as we scale the number of Bicep files we use in the future, we will have to use these outputs as inputs later on for different resources. And you'll see that later on as well. So let me collapse. So we now have, as part of this Bicep file, we have a new resource. This is a custom resource policy definition. I've just named it policy. Okay, so you can name this resource whatever you like. I've kept it very generic, very high level policy. It's easy to reference and remember. So we have our initiative 1 from level 1, the previous deployment. I've also added a new initiative which will use this custom policy here. Assignment 1 is the pre-existing one, and assignment 2 is going to be assigning the initiative to. Let me show you what the custom policy looks like. Open this up a bit. So this custom policy. It's for tag governance. So it's just adding a tag to a resource group. It contains a lot of the same properties you've seen before with the initiative and assignment. So we've got metadata properties here, the parameter values here as well. So tag name and tag value will be as part of the initiative, as part of the definition. I'm assigning a default value, which I'm later on overriding as part of the deployment. The policy rule. So policy rules are, these are your conditions. It's really cool to see that your policy rules can be whatever you like, as long as there is a valid alias or a valid field that you can use as part of that rule. So there is almost an infinite number of different combination of policy rules and effects, and it's really like, this is only scratching the surface. I cannot emphasize enough how large of scale to scale that this can go. If you look in some of the built-in policies, the more complex one, you'll see the policy rules can get very, very long, very large. So I think this custom policy is only doing a very simple task here, but just know that this is a really big area of policy as code. Okay, so the effect here is modify. You can use a parameter, of course, for the effect. So depending on your environment, maybe you want the effect to be modify. Maybe in prod, you want that modify effect. In dev test and non-prod, you might have that to audit. It's up to you. Here, I've just statically set the modify value, which means if there's a non-compliant resource group in my environment after I assign this policy, it's going to modify that resource group and add in the mandatory tag, key, and value. So role definition ID here, because this is a modify effect, we need to pass in what is the managed identities access that is required to complete the modify effect. And this role definition ID, I believe it is the contributor. It is the contributor role. So in Azure, in your Azure subscription, in RBAC, it is the contributor role here. I have tested before as well using I think it's there's a policy RBAC role which doesn't have as much permissions as contributor, or there's a tag contributor role that I've tested as well, and I just found it didn't work as expected. So I've kind of defaulted now to just using straight up contributor. But maybe in the future, if you have any feedback as to whether you've tried other RBAC roles as part of your policy as code or custom policies, let me know really what works and what doesn't for you. Okay, so that's really the gist of our custom policy. And you've already looked at the initiative 1 that I showcased just a few minutes ago. Initiative 2, this is our initiative for the custom policy. And let me show you what's different here. So remember in the previous walkthrough, we were using the built-in policy definition IDs. We had to statically assign those and reference those within our initiative. So for here, because we're creating this resource, this custom policy as part of this Bicep file, we can reference the actual resource name here. So policy and then dot, and just reference the ID directly. So we don't need to remember what is the actual ID of this custom policy that's being created, you know? And then these parameters, we're passing these in from our deployment as well. Assignment 1 you've already seen. Assignment 2, this is going to assign our new initiative to our environment. So it uses the initiative 2 ID, which is part of this Bicep file, and it's passing in the tag name and tag value to the assignment, which are defined at the very top. I like to keep all the parameters at the very top. It's kind of just a single place we can have all these values that may change frequently. So you can see here, allowed locations, Australia East. These are the allowed SKUs for virtual machines. These are just default values again. And what I'll show you now is I have parameter files. So I have 2 parameter files for 2 environments, devtest.json and nonprod.json. So now what I'm going to do is I'll show you. So these parameter files, I think they should live in your repository as part of source control. And so let's say as part of dev test, I want to have the list of allowed locations to be greater. So I want to have, Australia East, Southeast, East US, etc. But as part of non-prod, I may want to constrain that because non-prod is closer to prod. So I may want to constrain which locations can actually be used as part of my Azure governance, right? So here you can see I've defined just two regions, Australia East, Australia Southeast, and they're being passed into the list of allowed locations parameter key as part of our nonprod.json file. Similar story with allowed SKUs. So I've added in two SKUs here, standard D2S v3 and D4S v3. In dev test, I've only got some B1 and B2 SKUs here because I don't want, let's say for example, I don't want in dev tests someone to deploy or be able to use a SKU which is going to be very costly. That's something I think you can easily constrain and govern from Azure Policy as code and from the built-in policy that's being used here. So assignment location, assignment identity location, this is something new. Remember before I did mention that some assignments will need to have a managed identity or an identity created because of the policies in that assignment and in that initiative are using a modify effect or a deploy effect that needs an identity to be able to make that change to the resource. So here's what it looks like as part of assignment 2, which is for our tag governance policy. So the block that needs to be set within assignment 2, which is different from assignment 1, is this location block. So here we're passing in the location. This is used for the managed identity that's created, and the type here is system assigned. So I don't know. Yeah, so the type, there's 2 values here that you can possibly use. There's none and system assigned. In my experience, I've never used none. Interested to know in the comments or in your feedback, have you tested creating managed identity as part of an assignment and used none for the type? How does that work? Does that actually operate the way you think it works? So again, yeah, these assignment identity location values are passed in from our JSON file per environment. So it may change. Maybe dev test is going to be Australia Southeast in terms of the managed identity, and maybe non-prod is going to be Australia East. Okay, so in our dev test file, in our parameter file, we've got the value here for the mandatory tag1 value as part of our custom policy. I've set that to dev test. And in the non-prod parameter file, I've set that to non-prod. So I'll just demonstrate how this looks like when we actually use it. So in the README file, again, I've got the commandlets you can use to run and test this. Let me go to my bash. So again, I've already authenticated. You may want to authenticate if you're just starting out yourself without running through level 1. So you got the authentication command that's here. Again, I can run the Bicep build command to look at the JSON ARM template, but I won't do that. It's completely optional. This scenario is designed to be used by multiple environments, right? So, again, single code base, that main Bicep file getting deployed out to multiple subscriptions or multiple tenants. To do that using CLI, we need to set our account context for authentication to the right subscription, and that's what these commandlets do here at the beginning. For the purpose of this demo, I'm only going to use that one subscription and just deploy the same Bicep file and with different parameters, just to show you how that works from a single environment use case. So let me copy this deployment. So this is going to be for dev test. You can see I'm referencing main.bicep and I'm passing in with a p switch here, params-devtest.json. So I'll run this. I'm in the level 2 folder within my CLI. And if I go to the portal, I should start to see the initiative number 2 show up as an assignment, and I should see the initiative 2 definition created as well if everything works. All right, so refreshed. So we got initiative 1 that came through from our initial deployment. It is still being deployed again as part of this code. I haven't excluded it from main.bicep because I like to think of your policy development as a kind of iterative process. So I've included the level 1 type resources here, initiative 1, assignment 1, in the same Bicep file. So let's look at initiative 2, which is the latest one. You can see the tag name and tag value are being passed in from that parameter file. So dev test is the value that comes from that dev test parameter file that I referenced with my CLI deployment. And if we look at the actual assignment, policy enforcement enabled, that's expected. It's at subscription scope, parameters here, remediation. So this is what's different. This remediation part, it's different from the initiative 1 assignment because, again, this uses a policy definition that contains a modify effect. So it needs to create a managed identity. It needs to create a managed identity in your subscription. And the location here you can see is Australia East, which is that value was passed in from the parameter file. So there's a principal ID as well for the managed identity, and you can see the permissions. The permissions are contributor, which is actually, this permission was actually come from the policy definition, the custom policy definition. So we haven't set any non-compliance messages, but we will later on as part of the next demo. And now let me show you. So that was dev test. So now let me deploy the non-prod parameter file. I just copied that non-prod commandlet here, the commandlet string. Again, normally you would authenticate, if you're doing CLI, you would authenticate to your non-prod environment before you run this. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm just doing this within a single environment just to speed up the process a bit, so I don't have to switch between different environments. So that's running. And what you should see after that deployment using non-prod parameter finishes, you should see the value for the tag, the mandatory tag value change. Looks like that's finished. So I'll refresh my policy screen. There you go. So now the mandatory tag value is non-prod. It's still the same tag key name because we haven't changed that. We haven't overridden the default tag key name, but you can clearly see non-prod there. Everything else remains as expected. I don't think there are any other differences really. So the managed identity is still, oh, so it's a different principal ID. So it's basically been recreated. Same location, but it's a new managed identity now because I've run that commandlet again to the same environment. Okay. So this is really, let me just wrap up level 2. So this really showcases how to use a single Bicep file with built-in policies and custom policies, how to do manual CLI deployment to multiple Azure environments, how to use parameter files for specific values, which may differ between different environments. So this is, I think, this is a good starter if perhaps you're familiar with Bicep, you're familiar with Azure policy, and you're just looking to get up to speed with some possible options for your proof of concept or for a small sized deployment as part of your policy as code. So all the details for this walkthrough are in the GitHub repo, of course. The link is in the description of the video if you need to reference that later. Now let's move on to the more advanced deployment. So this is the final code walkthrough that I'll provide as part of this demonstration today. Level 3, let me go through this here. Level 3, it's again, you can use built-in policies and custom policies. We're going to use multiple initiatives and assignments. Something that's really cool that I want to highlight is the ability to use custom policy definition reference IDs in your initiatives, and we need to do that, I believe, because when we're assigning custom non-compliance messages targeting policies, we need something human readable that we can identify with for the policy within that policy set within that initiative. So I'll show you what this means. If it's not making sense, don't worry. Important thing here as well is we're using modules. So as part of level 3, we're going to use modules as part of organizing our resources. So definitions will be in their own module, initiatives will be in their own module, assignments will be in their own module. And that just means we're changing our sort of design for using a single main.bicep file. We're now scaling that out so that we have resource types in their own Bicep file, which I think makes it more manageable at scale. It's something I've picked up with my experience. I don't know if you maybe prefer using a main.bicep file yourself for everything, if that makes it easy for you, and then you don't have to deal with inputs and outputs between module files. Let me know in the comments if that's the case. I'm interested to know. We're also going to use CI/CD workflow automation using GitHub Actions YAML, which is really great as part of offloading the deployment to automation and ensuring our code is constantly working, constantly clean, really just taking the burden off of someone manually deploying something and possibly mistyping one of the parameter file names or something like that, or using the wrong credentials. This is a really great use case, I think, for CI/CD, which I'll show you in this coming demo. We're going to use GitHub secrets for authentication to our multiple environments. So these will be organization level secrets. You can also have repository level secrets. I like to use organization level secrets in my open source org because it just makes them, I guess, more reusable at scale. So it's up to you how you want to use secrets. Parameter files, of course, we'll be using those again. Very important tool in your policy as code workflow. So level 3, level 3 here. So you can see, actually I'll open this from my Visual Studio Code. And again, I'll change my directory to level 3 folder. So let's look at it. So the YAML files here for the workflow automation, I won't go into this initially. This will kind of be the last thing I touch on as part of this demo. Parameter files, I've showcased this to you just a few minutes ago, but I will show you some new parameter values that I'm passing in as part of my deployment. You'll notice there is still a main.bicep file here. The reason for that is because this is, even though we now have resource types separated to their own bicep files, we still need to call a single bicep file in our deployment. And this is really, you might think of this as, you know, a parent module file, and then all these other bicep files per resource here are child module files here that are called by the parent. And I've actually just named the bicep files with a prefix of R. That way they're all grouped together. I don't know, I'm not sure if you use a different naming convention for your bicep files. Also remember, I did mention before, you don't have to name your bicep files main, so you can name them whatever you like. I think having the name as the resource type helps to identify what is that bicep file used for, and that's what I've gone with here. So let's take a look at definitions just quickly. Actually, I'll go through the key differences in every single resource file. So definitions hasn't changed much. This is still containing my single custom policy for adding a tag to a resource group. It has fewer parameters and variables compared to what I was working with in the previous demo, because it's really just this serves a purpose of managing custom definitions as part of my policy as code. So it doesn't need a whole lot of parameters and different inputs here. It's very, very I think minimal, which I like. So everything else is the same. I haven't changed anything here as part of what you just witnessed in the previous level 2 demonstration. Assignments has changed. Actually, I should go to initiatives next. So initiatives, important note here is, see this level 3 comment that I put in to the new parameter. So we need to, because we now have split up our bicep files per resource type, we need to provide some inputs. So as part of initiative 2, remember that initiative 2 is it contains a custom policy that I'm creating from another bicep file. So I need to provide a parameter value here, which will be used as an input for the initiative as part of this bicep file. So that's what this custom policy string is. I'm not assigning a default value because the policy ID may change. So I've just got the pure parameter with no default value defined here. And let me show you what that looks like from the initiative 2. So here you can see policy definition ID. If you remember from the previous demo, I think I referenced policy.id because the resource was in the same bicep file. And now I'm referencing the actual parameter name that I set as part of this new bicep file. Just for initiatives, I'm referencing a custom policy ID parameter name, which is going to get passed in from my parent bicep file you'll see later. Everything else as part of this initiative file remains the same, except for I now have policy definition reference ID as a value, parameter value, sorry, not parameter value, but property value that I'm passing into each definition as part of the initiatives. So notice how I'm using the name of the policy. So remember before I showed you in the portal If I, for instance, if I open this initiative, and remember previously I showed you the reference IDs here are not very human readable. So they are auto-generated. You can see here. And as part of this new policy as code deployment, I'm actually going to set the reference ID to match what the policy name is. And that way we can easily reference that reference ID in a policy assignment when we do a custom deny message later on. Okay. So that's per policy definition. It's just a new property that we pass in there. And in the assignments, there's again inputs for the initiative IDs that I've defined with no default values. There's also a non-compliance message contact email. So let me show you what the non-compliance looks like for an assignment. So to use non-compliance messages with Azure, with the Azure policy assignments resource, I think you need to be using this API for your resource. I think it's 2020-0901. Now, in the future, of course, there'll be new APIs, but this perhaps might be the minimum. If you're finding perhaps, like let's say you're on an older API. So if I change this to say 2018, notice how some of these properties I've been passing in policy as code have a warning now. So enforcement mode has a warning against it. Also with non-compliance messages, it's saying it's not allowed. That's because the API doesn't support those properties. So if you're finding in your policy as code deployment, you cannot use non-compliance messages, make sure you're using one of the latest APIs out there. So here I'm using 2020-09-01. And the non-compliance messages, this is when you pass in a non-compliance message, when you don't set a policy definition ID for this JSON block here, this is going to be the default non-compliance message for all policies in your assignment, if that makes sense. So here I'm passing in a message. It's a concatenated string. So I'm saying your resource deployment is not compliant with, and this is something that the user or the developer or the engineer will see if they happen to get denied for any reason against your policy assignment. So it's saying your resource deployment is not compliant with the, and then using the parameter name of the assignment policy, and then please contact, and then I have a parameter value called non-compliance message contact email here. So I think this, I hope this is like a helpful message if someone were to be denied by my policy assignment. You have, I think you have some pretty good freedom with this string that you can input here as part of your non-compliance messages. So let me show you. So that's assignment 1, the non-compliance message. Let me show you assignment 2, which actually uses the so it has a non-compliance message, which is kind of a default message for the assignment. And here I've also got another non-compliance message, but it is specifically targeting a policy definition in the assignment, in the initiative, right? So remember, previously we talked about how the definition reference IDs are these non-human readable, auto-generated long strings, hard to remember. So as part of our initiatives in this level, we did assign definition reference IDs to be actual names. So names that you remember, right? And names that are easily identified. So that's what you're seeing here when I'm referencing a policy definition reference ID. This is something I've assigned custom as part of the initiative, as part of a policy as code, and it means I can easily target that policy definition, and this custom message here will be only for if someone is actually denied that for that specific policy. And I'll show you what this looks like in the portal as well after we deploy this. So parameters, again, we've got different parameter files per environment. So dev test, non-prod, and prod. And we're passing in a non-compliance parameter value for the contact email here. So I've made this different per environment. So for prod, I've got prod-policyteam@mail.com, right? It's not a real email address, I hope. But I've just shown it here to show you the differences per environment. So non-prod is going to be a non-prod email address. Dev test will be a dev test email address. So each parameter file will have different values. Now, let me show you, so I won't save that. Let me show you deployment of this. So in the folder repo, the README file here contains the same CLI commands that you can use to manually deploy this policy as code environment. And it's pretty much the same as what you saw in the previous demonstration, except we now have a prod environment here at the very end. And let's touch on main.bicep. So again, this is our primary file. So in our deployments, we're referencing main.bicep. We don't reference the individual resource bicep files when we deploy. We're only referencing our parent bicep file here. And we have some default values set as part of our deployment. We are also overriding these default values with those parameter files, those JSON parameter files. But you don't have to set default values. I just set it here as an example. If perhaps you don't have parameter files ready to go and you just wanted to use the default values, you could use these. So here, this is the first time I've shown you modules, module usage in this walkthrough. So here, the module definitions, so these module names, they need to be unique within the bicep file. And I've just tried to keep them generic and simple. But you may, as you scale out your deployment, you may want to have more specific naming for your modules. So here, this is the module for my definitions. It's using the same definition value as a name there as well. And it references my definition file, which is local to that bicep file. So it's just a // there. And here, this block here, these are the parameter files, the parameter values that I'm passing in as part of this module. So notice if I remove one of these parameters, I then get a warning on that module to say, hey, your module for definitions is missing one of the required parameter values that you've specified in your module. So it even tells me what the parameter value is missing there. So if I just add that in again, and I reference my parameter as part of this bicep file up here, which is mandatory tag1 value. So there's no more warning, that's been cleared. Initiatives is the same pattern. Module initiatives, referencing the initiatives resource in the local folder, passing in the parameters. Notice the custom policy ID parameter. So that's the tag governance custom policy. This references the definitions module and then outputs of that definition. So if I wanted to set this again, I would go, okay, reference the module name definitions, and then outputs, and then policy ID is the output name. So this is something you'll do repeatedly when you use modules. You'll need to define outputs as part of your resources and child module files, if you want to call them that, and you need to define inputs when you're actually calling that module from your main.bicep file. Hopefully that's simple enough to understand. And then assignments is the final module that we have here for our assignments resource. This has a lot more parameters that we're passing in. Again, similar to the initiative module, we're passing in the IDs for the initiatives, and it references the initiatives module, the outputs of the initiative module, and then the individual initiative ID that we define from our initiative file. And if I go to my initiative file, this is the ID name. So initiative 1 ID, it's a string, and it references the resource and then the ID of that, which we then use for our assignment later on. So that's, in a nutshell, that is the main.bicep file. It's very condensed. So the way I like to think of it is you spend a lot of work and time developing your policy as code, parameters, and your individual resource files, and then from a higher level, from your calling parent module, you'll work on your main.bicep file. Only maybe 10% of your time really. There's not much to do in here other than calling the module that you want to call and passing in parameter values. So you don't really have to deal with any sort of JSON concatenation or anything like that. It's very, very simple, and it's really just designed there to be the entry point for your policy as code. Cool. So if you have any questions about that or comments, let me know in the chat. I will now look to deploy this. So I'm going to deploy the dev test parameter file first. So I'm copying the commandlet for dev test. I am in the context of the level 3 folder here, so everything is local. So as part of this deployment, you should see the new properties that we are deploying as part of this, which is mainly the non-compliance messaging. After I run through this as well, I will show you the GitHub Actions and the YAML, which is really, really cool in terms of automating your workflow and keeping it, as fluid as possible, and not dependent on a human resource actually hitting the deploy button. So that finished fairly quickly. Let me jump back into the portal here and look at assignments. So we've still got those 2 initiatives. If I look at initiative 1 and I look at the edit assignment, non-compliance messages. So remember, initiative 1 is we're only sending a default non-compliance message. So that's what's come up here. You can see. Note that it's using the dev test email, because when I ran the CLI command to deploy my policy as code, I did reference the dev test parameter file here. So there's also no non-compliance message specific to the individual resources, but we can change that later on if we wanted to. But this should handle any deny messages that engineers and developers may come up against as part of this governance. So that's non-compliance sorted through policy as code using parameter files, and this message is meant to be helpful. I just want to emphasize that, if it's not helpful, I don't think there's any value in having a non-compliance message that doesn't help someone to meet compliance. You know what I mean? So let me show you initiative 2. This is for our tag governance. So we've got a custom policy in initiative 2. This is the assignment for initiative 2, and in our non-compliance messages, you can see here we've got a default non-compliance message, and we also have a individual non-compliance message for that individual policy. So if I had multiple policies in this initiative, I could actually have a non-compliance message that differs per policy, just control as code, and that is the coolest thing that I can think of in terms of feature. So you can see if I just highlight that, it does provide an email address for someone to contact if they do come up against this, if they're not sure on how to meet that compliance. And you can change this non-compliance message to whatever suits your purposes. Okay, so that's the non-compliance part of it as part of our sort of level 3 demonstration. Let me do prod as well, because I haven't run this as part of this. So the prod parameters will use a prod email address for non-compliance. It'll also set the mandatory tag 1 value to prod. And remember, it includes more allowed SKUs in the parameter array here. So in production, you're probably going to have a greater you're going to have greater flexibility for what SKUs are allowed, because it is production and it has higher requirements. Allowed locations remains pretty much the same as non-prod, so just 2 regions there. And the assignment enforcement mode is default. Okay, so my prod deployment finished. Let me refresh the portal. If I look at initiative 1 and assignment parameters. So there are 2 regions, and we have all those SKUs coming in from our parameter file. Again, there's no remediation task because it's not using deploy if not exists or modify. Our non-compliance message now references the prod email address, which is passed in from our parameter file. And if I look at initiative 2, you can see the tag value here is prod. Let me showcase this tag governance. So if I deploy a new resource group, so let's call this Global Azure. If I deploy this to the Australia East region, now you can see immediately it is actually, after the deployment finish was very quick, it's actually immediately added the mandatory tag key name and the value that I set as part of policy as code. So this is something I really think is underutilized in terms of enterprise governance at scale. Having the ability to modify resources as they are created in your environment and manage the tag governance of them. You might not know exactly what values need to be assigned per tag key, for instance, but you can assign temporary values and then go and fix them up later. And this is just one example where I've used policy as code and policy to manage tag governance, which should help in the overall governance of your environment, as you have hundreds and thousands of resources to manage there. So that's one example there. Let's dive into the YAML. So I've showcased the modules. I've showcased deployment of different parameters using those modules using CLI. Now, one part of your workflow at scale that I've mentioned many times is GitHub Actions and CI/CD. So let me dive into this. So the continuous deployment workflow, it can take a few number of patterns. The way I like to work with it is I like to have a single job triggered on a push to the main branch. And it references, it's filtering for any files that are of Bicep type. So like, let's say, if I update the README file or a non-Bicep file in my environment, I may not necessarily want my continuous deployment job to kick off. And so that's why I kind of reference a Bicep file type here. Workflow dispatch is a newish, I'm not sure how new, but it is an option there within GitHub Actions. So you can manually trigger and kick off the actual action from the portal or through CLI. And I like to have that there as well. Now schedule here is commented out, but it is usable. So schedule this cron job here, this cron task. If you use this exact value for the cron schedule, it'll run the Bicep CD job once per day at a specific time. That kind of ensures, if there's any changes to the Azure portal side or something outside of your source control repo, it confirms that your policy as code workflow is still going to work. And I've had instances before where policy names, built-in policy names have changed, or maybe something has changed in the API, and my job failed, and I then had to go and update policy as code, but I wouldn't have picked that up if I wasn't aware of what had failed. And this schedule is kind of a catch-all. It's kind of insurance to make sure your policy as code is healthy and working, even at night when you may not be using it, for instance. Okay, so there's a few jobs here. So the way I structured it is per environment. So similarly to how I've shown you how we run the CLI commands to deploy our Bicep files using the different parameters, I have a job here per environment. And if I just step through here, what each of these jobs do, initially they all follow a very similar pattern with some key differences. So initially it needs to check out the repository, and that's this checkout job here. It needs to log in and authenticate. So this is using the Azure GitHub Action for authentication and login. And the credentials are secrets stored in our GitHub organization or our GitHub repo. So if I show you my organization, settings, I think, secrets. There we go. So I have 3 SPNs, service principals, per environment. And I've named them with dev test, non-prod, and prod in terms of the actual secrets I've created in my organization. Now, similarly, you may use a similar pattern, or you may use a single SPN for multiple environments. It's really up to you. But this is a way you can consume SPN authentication at scale. So I've stored these credentials in my public organization, and I'm referencing them within the YAML file for this GitHub action here. So dev test, this is the exact secret name in my organization, and it ensures I'm authenticating to the right environment as part of this workflow. The name of this job here that's going to kick off is Bicep CD. I'm assigning an ID. This is important because what I found with Bicep, sometimes when you deploy using automation, and there's all these different dependencies between your Bicep files, which are automatically calculated, of course, but sometimes the deployment fails. Perhaps there's a policy definition or an initiative that has not completed the creation, and there's a resource that's coming up next that depends on that, which is then failing because it can't find that resource. That's something that can happen as part of CI/CD. I've found. So I've put in an ID for this initial task for deployment, and this is an ID I'm referencing later on within an if statement for basically retry logic. So as I retry a failed deployment, it's going to reference that ID. If that job fails, if that task fails, it will run this retry logic, and most of the time it is successful. But when it's not successful, I want to be able to automatically kick off a retry job, so I don't have to go and troubleshoot. Why did this fail? I just want it to run and be successful in the end, right? So this this inline script here for the CLI job, it's pretty much an exact copy of what I've been running manually in CLI. So when I run, AZ deployment subcrate, I'm also running that from the GitHub Actions YAML. I'm referencing the folder name this time. So I need to reference folder name and then main.bicep. Still setting a location for the deployment. Still referencing the individual environment parameter files. I have added an O none switch. So that means I'm not outputting any sort of JSON format or table format. I just want it to be as minimal as possible. The next job along is a sleep job. It will only run if the initial deployment job fails for any reason, and that uses a public GitHub action from Julian, and that sleeps for 30 seconds. So I kind of found, maybe if there is a resource that hasn't finished creating yet as part of the initial deployment, 30 seconds is roughly the amount of time to wait before it is ready and available to be referenced by say an initiative, a policy initiative, or a policy assignment. And then the retry job there is also only going to run if the initial deployment fails, and that's basically the exact same commandlet as the initial deployment. Now, so what I've done is that's dev test. I've duplicated that to non-prod and to prod jobs, just with the exception, non-prod, of course, we're referencing the non-prod credentials. We're referencing the non-prod parameters as well. I'm actually setting a name. Something you may notice, I'm setting a name for the deployment job. So this name will appear in the portal. It's not, I don't think it's that critical to set a name, but I do like to have an environment specific name for the deployment, so it is easily identifiable. And let me show you how this works. So like I mentioned, it can be manually triggered by this workflow dispatch. So if I go back to my repository, policy as code, and I go to, so these workflow files are in the GitHub Actions workflow folder here. So there's Bicep CD, Bicep CI. And if I go to the actions within the repo, click on Bicep CD, I can run this manually using run workflow straight out of the portal. You can also kick off the workflow runs through GitHub CLI. I'm not going to showcase it in this session because I haven't set it up and tested it, but you can definitely do it. So here's run workflow. I'm just clicking that off through ClickOps, selecting my branch. It's going to run. Let me refresh this. So you can see initially the way the YAML file is configured. Dev test will run first, followed by non-prod and then prod. These are the job dependencies. So non-prod depends on dev test and prod depends on prod. And in the YAML configuration, what that actually relates to is this property here called needs. So if you want to set this up yourself, I do recommend setting a needs property and then setting the value of your job that you want to depend on for, say, non-prod, for instance. If you didn't, I think if you didn't set a needs dependency on different jobs, it would just try and run all of these jobs in parallel at the same time. Okay, so dev test is running. Once this completes, we should see from the portal, that my initiative parameter values that are being passed in from the deployment will change to dev test. Now currently they are prod, if you remember. And this does take, usually it takes about a minute or two. Okay, so that was successful for a dev test. It took less than a minute, which is great. You can see the retry logic didn't have to run because the initial job was successful here. So these were actually skipped. These jobs were skipped, but if it did fail, if the initial job failed, the retry would of course kick off, and it would hopefully complete the job successfully. So that's finished. Now it's moved on to non-prod, but let me look in the portal and refresh my dev test environment. Now we can see the parameter values have changed to my dev test parameters. So we've got our tag value here, dev test. And if I look at the assignment for non-compliance, you can see it's referencing the dev test email address here as well. So that is out of the box what a CI/CD workflow looks like using GitHub Actions. It's going to continue on to all the other environments which will run in the background. I will show you as well the CI job. So the integration job is actually just very similar to the deployment job. It uses the Bicep file filter. The steps though are slightly different in that it's using a community created GitHub action to actually build the Bicep file. So that's very similar to, if you ran AZ Bicep build, just to validate that the file is valid JSON and ARM template. That's what this community GitHub action does, and that runs on pull requests, it runs on push, and it runs on a schedule as well. Okay, so CD job is finished with non-prod. Let's see if there was any retry. Nope, no retry logic triggered. Prod will be the final one. I don't know if I'll wait for that. But basically, I just want to wrap up the level 3, and then we'll move on to questions and also hopefully some swag. So level 3, we looked at using built-in policies and custom policies. We looked at using multiple initiatives and assignments. We also covered a really cool feature of Azure Policy Now, which allows you to set custom deny messages and non-compliance messages as part of the assignments, and how we use the policy definition reference ID and initiatives to manage that at scale. We looked at advanced module usage, organized per resource type. So you may not do this, but I feel like there is a point in your policy as code journey where you have a number of resources that, and if you're managing a single Bicep file with all these resources, it gets to the point where it's just very hard to keep track of everything. And you may want to, at that point, you may want to look at to split up the resource types into different modules, like I've shown you in as part of level 3 here. Now I've just shown you CI/CD workflow with GitHub Actions. Very, very important, extremely useful for doing things at scale, doing things with automation. I've shown you how to use GitHub secrets and referencing that within your GitHub Actions YAML. And again, we're using parameter files for environment-specific values. So that pretty much wraps up level 3. There's other resources within the repo you can leverage. If you have any suggestions, I think I am open to pull requests. It is a public repository, so certainly log an issue, log a pull request. The community is only as good as those that contribute. So I'm really interested to hear your feedback. And let me check this action. Yeah, so prod was successful. You can see dev test took the least amount of time, really. 1 minute, 25 seconds. Non-prod, 1 minute, 32. Prod was 2 minutes, slightly longer, but it completed. And it was all successful the first time. I think because maybe I've run this multiple times over the past few days to those environments, so it has no excuse to fail on me. So let me go back to the slides to kind of wrap up here. So the takeaways I've shown you at the beginning of this session. Tooling, we've covered tooling, Visual Studio Code, GitHub Actions, the VS Code policy extension, how to build for reusable code, consistent naming benefits, CI/CD, testing. I think I haven't had time much to get into that, but I will look to do that in another session. Community, of course, very important. I've benefited a lot from the policy community over the years, and I hope it continues. So, question and answer. Let's see if I have any questions in the chat. Questions are not coming in yet, but that's fine. These are my socials if you'd like to connect or have any questions or just want to chat about stuff. I am available 9 to 5. Give me a bell, ping me. Let's connect and talk about Azure policy. I'm very interested in knowing how you use Azure policy as code and how you use Bicep with Azure policy. I realize Bicep is a newish language with Azure policy, so perhaps it's not as common and mainstream as I would like. But certainly, it's not the only tool out there. But I am interested to see what your experiences are with policy as code and Bicep. Whoops, did I miss a slide? No, we were meant to have, here we go. So we do have some swag if you would like to participate in this swag bounty. Now, this swag is only available for a limited time, I believe. Let me move my screen. Nope. There we go. Hopefully that helps. So this swag is available for a limited time. You can get a learner badge. You can get a cool virtual background as well with for your Teams or Zoom meetings. Just follow that link or scan the QR code on the screen. So that pretty much wraps it up, guys. Happy to take any questions later on if you're viewing this outside the live session. It's been really great to be a part of this event, Global Azure. And yeah, I hope to see you another year and hope to see you online sometime. Thanks very much.